I'd just like to say it's a great honor for us to be here today and to do this presentation. Both Jodi and I will be presenting on the topic at hand. I'll be looking at what Lookout has done over the years, and Jodi will go much more into detail around the Housing First principles. So, yeah, go. Yeah, sure. Sounds good. So, you know, with the Lookout, simply put, we really try to help people become, you know, self-sufficient, get off the street, and prevent them from returning to the street. We provide non-sectarian lay services to both adult men and women, and provide all sorts of options and opportunities for them to move forward within the housing continuum. A lot of the challenges range from chronic homelessness to alcohol and drug issues. You know, and Lookout provides obviously an open door services to anybody and everybody who comes through. Thank you. So Lookout was started way back when in 1971 in response to a large growing need for adult men, and started in the downtown east side with a 3-bedroom shelter and outreach program. We were providing, while providing emergency beds were essential, Lookout recognized that there was a massive need to provide solutions, not just to a Band-Aid approach. So starting in 1978, we gradually implemented long-term housing and shelters. A bed is not enough. To be a catalyst for change, we must provide stabilization and support programs that would range throughout the downtown east side and stretch out into New Westminster and other locations. So currently we're providing services on a range of 48 programs and 23 sites and within 5 municipalities. As we came together with the organization out in Surrey with Keys, and we merged with that organization in December, and we're able to bring all kinds of services to you know, 14 permanent housing, 2 health, dental clinics. We do a lot of social enterprises throughout the Lower Mainland. We're able to stretch and move people throughout the Lower Mainland to their residence and where they're sort of located and needed. One of the primary goals was to, yeah, you can go to the next one, was to develop a strategic plan that would really strengthen the programming within the Lookout and to reach out to the different communities. And we've really been doing that in a large way in terms of procurement and housing procurement for outreach services and that sort of thing. Can you, yeah, so, you know, our shelter and outreach statistics, you know, we've had over 5,800 shelter guests in 4 shelters. Really, the numbers show that there's a massive need to provide, you know, outreach and stronger services out there. And we're really hopeful that over the next little while, we'll be able to provide stronger services within the valley as well.
First of all, I want to say it's really great to be back in Abbotsford. I worked in this community for a period of 3 years, and it's really great to see some service providers here that I haven't seen in a while. When we got this topic to talk about, we were looking at the role of shelters in the Housing First model. And then after consideration and research, and I think Laura did a great job going over the principles and the definition, I'd really like to look at the way to implement a Housing First model into a pre-existing system like we have in Abbotsford. About a year ago, I don't know if Alice is here yet. Is she here yet, Alice? Oh, hi, Alice. She looks different today. About a year ago, or a little bit over that, we spent a long summer developing a Housing First program for Surrey. And it was really interesting. It was quite unique because it was a collaborative approach between 4 agencies that typically didn't work together. And we came together and looked at the assets of the community and found a way to apply Housing First principles to the community. So today I'd really like to look at the homeless system that we currently have in place and how Housing First can apply to that. A lot of the examples I will use will tie to Surrey because I'm most familiar to that, but there's a few things in Abbotsford as well that I would like to consider. So I think the first thing that we didn't really talk about much, and I have a little bit of critique at times, so I'll be careful on it. Housing First is a great model for a lot of single individuals, single men and single women. There's specialized populations, which we'll talk about throughout the presentation, that it's difficult for them to access the services. So when we're talking about Housing First, I think it's very important that we look at the eligibility criteria that are currently in place. For instance, to be defined as chronically homeless, you have had to be homeless for at least 180 days in a row. Next. Episodic homelessness, you've had to be homeless at least 3 times in the past year. You've had a tendency that lasted less than 30 days. And this is a very complex population, often those that are in an institution, because institutional staff are not necessarily asking about people's homelessness history. They're not able to really assess people's eligibility for the service upon discharge and release. So this is an illustration on the homeless serving system that currently exists in most communities. There's some examples that are here that aren't actually not even in really Canada at this point. A lot of these are in almost every other community, and I'd like to kind of go through each of them and highlight the role. So as Wes, when he started his talk, he talked about Lookout, for instance, in the downtown east side. We've been down there for 43 years. We've been operating a shelter for 43 years. So I think it's really important to emphasize the importance of Housing First and shelters. Shelters have been around for a very long time, 43 years in downtown east side, and they can really act as a hub for services. So if someone's really down and out and they really need to find somewhere to connect, a shelter is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The doors are open, and there's usually staff in there that can do an assessment. So the role of the shelters in a Housing First model is that they're a hub, they're a crisis center. They often have history with clients due to previous stay, and they have. It's also at times a good place for people to make connections with others that have actually experiencing the same experience. I think the other piece that's also very important, again, is looking at the eligibility criteria. For someone that's just homeless maybe for 2 weeks, maybe they lost their apartment due to a fire, or maybe they've gone through a breakup, they wouldn't be eligible for Housing First services. So a shelter, in their case, provides support to their needs. Is Nate McCready here? I thought I saw him. Hi, Nate. I remember last week we were you were looking at your stats from the Salvation Army here in Abbotsford, and there was 1,200 bed nights or shelter stays last year, and 300 of them were just a one-time shelter stay, correct? So those 300 people, by the definitions that we are applying Housing First, would not be necessarily eligible for the service. So I think Housing First, as I said, in that situation, 3/4 of the population would be potentially eligible for the services, but that 1/4 potentially are not. So transitional housing, what's a good example in Abbotsford? I guess it would be Christine Lamb would be a transitional housing program. The role of them, a lot of it has to do with helping people stabilize, to have some programming under their belt, to allow them to establish some kind of stability, to allow them a place for a next step. Go ahead. Let's go back for a second. I think it's really important to note, though, those that are graduating from a transitional housing program are not technically eligible always for Housing First. So when you're looking at an intake and a discharge to a Housing First program, I think that's kind of stuff in a community that you have to look at. So for instance, if there's a high proportion of people that were previously homeless that are living in a transitional housing program, based on the eligibility criteria, they're not necessarily eligible for Housing First. But what's kind of interesting, often in a transitional housing environment or a situation, the individual may have a residential tenancy agreement, but also they're under a program agreement. So in a little way, they're provisionally housed, because if you don't follow the program and the direction, your tenancy can end. So if you look at some of the other criteria around eligibility for housing first services, they are provisionally housed because essentially you have to be able to follow the rules. But for some people it really, really works, especially for moms with kids, and this is a new chance of like kind of redoing it again. And for the moms or the dads in the room, it's really hard to not have your kids for many, many years and then get them full back. So I think having a program like that is really, really beneficial. You can go to the next slide. Yeah. So supportive housing, an example that I could speak of in that we have in the downtown east side would be the Jim Green residence. So this residence is it's a lot of seniors, people that have very complex health issues that would find it very difficult to live alone in a community. They require a lot of social interaction with one another, they require on-support staff, and there's still a role for these people to live in the situation. And a lot of them, that's just where they age in place. And when they age in place, they really rely on their peers. So I think a scatter site model works very, very well for some populations, but we really have to remember the value of these types of programs. This is not very popular in Canada yet, but I think rapid rehousing is a language that we have to start really thinking about. It's very popular, I would say, in the United States when it comes to homeless families. And this is people that have never been homeless before, have not made their rent. And the idea is if you can get that person housed as fast as possible, they don't have to wait the 180 days or meet the other criteria, but right away, the likelihood of them being homeless again is next to nothing. I think it was like a 96% rate. So I think when we look at families in that structure, the idea is that they already have a pre-existing community. They have schools, they have appointments, they have friends, especially with kids or with couples, that it's really, really important the first time they come to a shelter that we have the ability to refer them maybe not to housing first, but really looking at a rapid rehousing philosophy, ways to really get them right back on their feet again and so that they can continue on. I don't really want to talk to you about case management as much because the expert's over here, Laura, but I really, again, think it's really important to understand the model of a clinical team approach, goal setting, looking at people's needs and meeting where they're at. And that's not defined by anybody besides the client. So the client is be able to say, you know, this is what's worked for me in the past, this is what's working for me right now, and which are ways that we can kind of work through it. The other piece that I think is really important for an integrated case management team, especially in a municipality like Surrey, even for some of the private market rental areas, there is a wait list. So this is a way to keep people engaged in their plan. Maybe it's going to take 5 or 6 days to really get them housed, but having a good plan that they own gives them some hope that this is actually going to make a difference and make a change this time. I'm a big, prevention person, and it was great to see Jane here today, and I'm glad that you're here because I always think of rent banks. But we can't really think about housing first and looking at a community and implementing in a community without really looking at prevention. So what can we do as a community and in a homeless social system that we can prevent homelessness occurring? I'm a big fan of formalized landlord-tenant agreements. So both the landlord and the tenant have rights and responsibilities laid out on a sheet of paper. There's a move-in inspection report. They can get their damage deposit back. This way, again, it's a way to keep people moving along the continuum and preventing potentially them having to access a shelter in the future. The other piece that a lot of people, and I think we all could learn something at times, is financial literacy. A lot of the folks that we deal with have never really had enough money to really consider what a budget is. But with support from the MCC, for instance, they're able to say, you know, you may make a very small amount of money on disability, but there are some ways that we can identify different assets and resources in your community to allow you to make ends meet. And maybe make a plan then on what a job would look like on top of that when you're on disability, making the extra $800 a month. Ways to expand your income, but kind of, you know, set goals for yourself. So I think prevention is also a really important piece to talk about when we're talking about housing first. Another American program, but we actually had a small pilot in Victoria when I was with BC Housing, was an asset development program, which is an escrow program. So essentially how it works, if you're a family living in subsidized housing, you move in and maybe your rent is like $200 a month, just for number's sake. And then you get a job. So your rent increases with your raise in income. So for instance, maybe your rent would go up to $300 based on your new job. So over time, that extra $100 is banked by a system, and it's an incentive to make more money. And over a period of time of 2 years, you gain this escrow, which is an amount of money that's actually cashed out to the individual. So it's more of an incentive to grow within where you are. So that is a very best practice. It's quite an expensive program, I believe, and I believe in Victoria it was always the Family Self-Sufficiency Program has a lot of value, but it is also very expensive to administer. But if you want to look at best practices through the US, I really would recommend it. Rent banks, I think, are huge support. And as I said, it's for those folks that have never had experienced homelessness, or maybe they've just had a big vet bill, for instance, and they're not able to meet the rent, and I've seen that before. So working with the rent bank to look at the extreme dire need that if I don't get my rent paid, I'm going to be homeless with my family at the end of the month, and then looking at a budget and support over time. The other piece as well, through an outreach component, or really working around a prevention lens, is looking at the 3 no's in the RTA. So you always pay your rent on time, you always get along with your neighbor, and you maintain your unit. And by really helping people understand those 3 principles of maintaining a tenancy, I think is very, very important to keeping people housed and not, again, so they're not accessing a shelter later on. And with prevention, again, supportive communities play a huge role. So support groups in the community around tenancy, skills, financial literacy, those things. Having friends that have actually gone through it, or colleagues or peers that have actually had a similar experience and that kind of support each other when things get a bit tough, I think have a huge role in looking at Housing First model. So affordable housing. There's little of it. And I would say, again, from a family example would be Surrey. I think we only have 1 massive affordable housing unit for moms and dads. Is that correct, Sheila? Perhaps, maybe? So yeah, there's a limited resource of pre-built affordable housing in our country. So for a lot of people, this is not an option. However, when it is there, I think we have to really identify it as an asset in our community and how we can utilize it, again, through a Housing First principle. Subsidized housing is, for especially families, the best way to keep people on track and raise your family over time. And then also looking at the role of rent subs. From the current HPS program that we're running in Surrey, we do have rent subs, but they are limited in their time. So I think it's really important when you look at implementing it in your community, are there rent subs available? What are the rules and the guidelines around using them? And what is the plan when they run out? So I think, again, from a long-term affordable housing point of view, we have to consider that perhaps things will change. There hasn't been an increase in rental stock since the 1980s. There hasn't been any incentive for builders to build rental apartments. And we really have to look at zoning bylaws to allow secondary suites in most municipalities. The other thing I'd like to speak about when it comes to affordable housing and Housing First, more from a prevention point of view, is that currently we don't it's a bit of a subsidy cliff. So if you are receiving subsidy for something and you make $5 or $6 over that amount, you automatically lose the subsidy. So I think looking at a model that allows people to make money and they're so slowly weaned off that amount is something that would really, really help from a prevention point of view. And that's what you'll see from like the rental assistance program for seniors and the safer subsidy. They are prorated to what you make, and they allow you to make a little bit of money, but your subsidy doesn't completely disappear. So when we talk of Housing First, we always talk about the role of outreach, and most of these people would not be successfully housed without an outreach team. When we talk about Housing First, and again, using Surrey as an example, we have 5 outreach teams that look out in Surrey, and they all have different mandates. However, working together and working collaboratively, we're able to come up with a case plan that's going to work for an individual based on their circumstance. An outreach team, especially one that works collaborative with other organizations, they can work together to support and assess and refer people to services that maybe one team would never think about. The other piece that I do mention here is the eligibility for services, whether it's ACT, Housing First, and ICM team. It's really having outreach teams really aware of the language and the criteria will allow people to access the services, and those that cannot access, we already have a plan B in place when we meet with them. Outreach teams have been around for quite a long time. Like in Surrey, they know the parks, they know the services, they know the landlords. So I think, again, in the same thing in Abbotsford, especially when you're dealing with a massive municipality with a lot of camps and so on, the outreach team knows where these people are. So before even looking at a housing first approach, again, it's looking at geographically, like where these folks are, and the outreach team knows. And they know how that changes over time and the season and the time of year and where they move, and if they're displaced here, where they will go. And a housing first model that's applied or implemented in a community, we always have to take that historical knowledge of the outreach team into consideration. The community-based support is huge, and also the ability to have the follow-up support. So I think with the Housing First model, especially the work of Brain City through Chez Soi, they really demonstrate how the follow-up piece, even talking about the woman with a goal of having groceries in her fridge every Friday, just having that simple follow-through is very, very important for people. I remember a few years ago, I met a man, and we housed him, this is 6 or 7 years ago, and we housed him. He was a frequent flyer at the shelter, and he kept on coming back. And we'd say, hey, what's up with you, Jerry? Like, why are you always coming back to the shelter? We think we have the work done. And he says to us, well, I miss hanging out with you guys. And plus, when I come to the shelter, things always feel like they're going to change. When I'm put in my house, I feel like that's the end of the road, and you guys are done with me. So having an outreach team to understand that once they're housed, it's really important to look at maintaining that and helping them make the next step to allow them to sustain that over time. So I hope that was a pretty good example. This is a tricky one to do, especially when we didn't have a chance to really share slides and speaking notes before. But when you are looking at Abbotsford as a municipality or looking at the Fraser Valley, really look at the assets that you have and what already exists. You may have to look at the way you do your business slightly, but through collaboration with other organizations or reaching out to Lookout or to Rain City or people that have already done it, you can come up with your own community-based model that's going to really work for Housing First. It's a research-proven model that is actually effective across North America and now even in Europe. So it's working, but I think it's very difficult sometimes to take the principles and apply them directly to your community. So looking at things like immediate access to the role of a shelter. A shelter, you always have staff there. They have rapport. Everyone knows where the shelter is. The police know where the shelter is. The ambulance knows. Everyone knows where to refer people. So I think utilizing or repositioning shelters to be an intake hub is very important for a community. Looking at choice. So I'm really mapping out the neighborhoods in Abbotsford, for instance. Where's a great neighborhood for people to be housed? Where does the transportation, where's the best bus line? Where can they bike? Where can they walk? But really looking at a municipality like Abbotsford, when you look at choice, what do the people want and what are the best way to support those people so that they're successful with their choice? Recovery oriented, again, ways to really engage providers, whether it's through working through mental health or addictions or brain injury or some kind of complex health issue. Finding ways to really support those that are in the housing and make sure that they have the right clinical support around them. Again, I think I haven't heard all the research from Surrey yet from the project, but I believe from the energy that we had when we developed the program, the collaborative effort really felt that we could finally make collective impact and change on people's lives. So I really encourage you to take your leaders in your community that are a part of the homeless system and really bring in what they can offer to this. Adapting community services. A good example in Surrey is that we worked with Surrey Memorial Hospital. So again, that when they're doing their discharge for folks to the street, they're actually asking in-depth questions about their homelessness history. And so when they're discharged to us at the shelter, we have a little bit of a history then, and then again, we can start looking at eligibility criteria for programs that may work for him or her. And then the other piece is the Remand Center in Surrey. At Surrey Pretrial, we're working with the correctional staff to really talk to folks about their previous history with homelessness. And really look at, upon discharge, would you be eligible for services? And if so, we'll connect them with the ICM team or a team that is able to pick them up where they are. Because, you know, when you look at recidivism, the longer someone is on the street after discharge, the more likely they are going to reoffend. There's research around the 72-hour model. So they say if you can connect with someone within 72 hours upon their release from an institution, the likelihood of that they're going to reoffend lessens by like 80%. So I think, again, looking at those best practices, and that's around a peer model as well, ways to really engage folks. So when they are leaving an institution, whether it's a hospital or a correctional system, that they have a plan in place that's going to allow them to connect with some teams. Fast track protocol used to be a big buzzword in income assistance back in the day. I think we have to look at finding ways to ensure that folks that are eligible for income assistance are fast tracked as fast as possible. So I think that waiting time, again, is an opportunity for people to fall between the cracks, but through an integrated system, and everyone kind of has a role in the game through Housing First, I think this will allow someone to have a choice and to find a place right away, and at least they have the income secured. So the last piece I think is important to look at is the considerations. What kind of can make Housing First challenging in some municipalities? So a lack of affordable housing and limited rent stock. We're seeing that and also landlord buy-in. So I think Rain City and other organizations through Chez Soi were really great in landlord engagement and in basically bending the rules a little bit, like getting the tenancy in the agency name opposed to the individual's name. You know, getting that 3 a.m. phone call to explain the behavior of their tenant. That landlord engagement is very, very important. And when you work in municipalities like Abbotsford and Surrey, sometimes those with the big buildings are almost the same landlord. So you really, really have to get in with the big people that do it. The other piece that is sometimes misunderstood, and through education through your organization, is crime-free multi-housing. So again, explaining to the individual that you may have a previous criminal record, but that doesn't mean that you're not allowed to live in that place, is that you have to abide by those rules that are set in place in that housing itself. Low vacancy rates, so yeah, it's great if we have some rent stops and maybe some landlords on the go, but if you have a case plan of 25 people, and maybe some of them have like 5 kids, you have to really look at vacancy rate and affordability in your municipality. Eligibility criteria, again, I spoke to it a little bit around Housing First. Some of the health authorities, mainly it was Fraser Health for a while, their eligibility criteria for some individuals, for instance, if you have an access to, so a personality disorder, you're not eligible for ACT services. So sometimes that's very challenging for teams to place people. So you may have someone that's Housing First eligible. Maybe she's been on the street for, I don't know, 190 days, and you have all that eligibility piece put in place, and you house her. But based on maybe a previous diagnosis of a personality disorder, it would be very challenging for a health authority to engage with her. She needs a different type of support model. So again, thinking outside the box, looking at what kind of assets you have in your community. And the availability of ongoing clinical support is a key piece that we were planning for in Surrey. So when we developed our Housing First model in Surrey, it was a little bit different than the Chez Soi because we didn't have that clinical component. We had to build that through partnership, and we have to ensure that that partnership's going to work over time. So when you do implement a Housing First model and you do have those partnerships with the health authority, I would really recommend a partnership brokering or partnership agreement that allows you to kind of monitor that engagement to make sure that the people that are meant to be served by clinicians are actually being taken care of. So overall, Housing First, as I said, is a best practice to end homelessness, and we have learned this over and over again. It's important to consider not all people are eligible for Housing First services. So that allows you a time to consider what has worked in your community and ways to leverage that expertise to meet a Housing First model to ensure success. And I think that based on shelters and outreach and repositioning their expertise and the way that they engage with individuals is a way to better house people through such a program. Thank you.